It was just another Tuesday morning at the little diner I've been visiting for years. The blue plate special was my go-to, and the smell of bacon sizzling on the grill always made me feel at home. As I sat in my usual booth by the window, sipping my coffee, I noticed a group of news reporters setting up outside. They were buzzing with excitement, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. As I took another sip, I glanced up at the TV hanging in the corner. The local news was reporting on a string of murders that had shaken Atlanta. 7 people had been killed over the course of a few weeks, and they were all connected somehow. The authorities had called it the work of a serial killer, but it seemed like the case had gone cold. There was talk about how the killer had disappeared, leaving the city in fear. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I never thought I'd be sitting in a diner, watching something like this unfold. Weeks turned into months, and life in Atlanta went on, but the memory of those murders lingered. I remember reading about them in the newspaper, seeing the faces of the victims. They were all regular people, moms, dads, young adults, each with their own story. The police were still looking for leads, but the killer had vanished. It felt like a horror movie plot, something you read about but never expect to happen in real life. Fast forward 12 years. I was sitting in the same booth, now an old habit, and the diner was packed with customers. A new waitress was serving coffee, and everything felt familiar yet different. Then, just as I was about to dig into my breakfast, I overheard a couple at the next table talking about the murders again. I strained to listen. "They say he might be back," one of them said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard he's reappeared in the city. They're worried he'll start killing again." My heart raced. Hadn't this been resolved? I quickly finished my meal and left a tip, my mind racing. The thought of that killer still being out there, after all these years, sent a wave of unease through me. I walked to my car, trying to shake off the anxiety. It couldn't be real, could it? Over the next few days, the buzz about the killer returned. News outlets were all over it, broadcasting stories about potential sightings and urging the public to stay vigilant. The police released a sketch of a man who had been seen near some of the crime scenes, but nothing concrete came from it. The feeling of dread hung over the city like a heavy fog. One evening, I was watching the news at home when they announced a breaking story. There had been another murder, right near the diner. I felt a chill run down my spine. The victim was a woman in her 20s, and the report showed her picture. I didn't know her, but she looked so familiar. The newscaster spoke about how the killer had returned to his old ways, and that people were terrified. I couldn't help but think about all the nights I had spent at the diner, feeling safe in my routine. Now, it felt like a trap. The police were urging everyone to be cautious, especially when walking alone at night. I made sure to stay alert and never let my guard down. Then, a week later, it happened again. Another murder, just blocks from the diner. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. The media frenzy was intense, and people were panicking. I started to notice more police patrols in the area, but that didn't help the growing fear. I kept going back to the diner, trying to find some normalcy in the chaos. But every time I walked in, my eyes would dart to the door, half expecting to see someone lurking outside. The waitress I had gotten to know, Sarah, seemed worried too. We chatted one morning about the murders, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "I just don't get it," she said. "How can someone just come back like that after all this time?" One night, after closing time, Sarah and I were cleaning up the diner. It was late, and I was the last customer left. As we were wiping down tables, I noticed a figure standing outside the window. My heart raced. It was too dark to see clearly, but it felt like someone was watching us. I pointed it out to Sarah, and we both froze. The figure didn't move for a long time, and just as I was about to say something, it disappeared into the shadows. I felt a chill, and we hurried to finish cleaning. We locked up quickly and I walked Sarah to her car. The streets were empty, and an eerie silence filled the air. It felt like we were the last two people in the world. The next day, the news broke about another murder, and this time, the victim had been last seen at the diner. My heart sank. I couldn't believe it. I felt sick thinking that someone from our community was in danger. It made everything feel so personal. The diner was no longer a safe haven, it had become a target. That evening, I stayed late at the diner, hoping to help out. We were all on edge, and the owner, Joe, decided to keep the diner open later than usual. The chatter among customers was filled with worry. I overheard people discussing how they felt trapped in their own city, and I could see fear etched on everyone's faces. Suddenly, the diner door swung open, and in walked a man who looked out of place. He was disheveled, with wild hair and a gaunt face. I felt a knot in my stomach as I watched him take a seat at the counter. He ordered a coffee, but didn't seem to engage in conversation. Something about him gave me the creeps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was connected to the recent events. As the night wore on, I kept stealing glances at him. Joe was serving him, but the man didn't seem interested in anything other than his drink. My anxiety built, and I finally decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. As I did, I caught a glimpse of the man through the window. He was staring at me, and my heart raced. I hurried back inside. When I got back in, the atmosphere was tense. A couple of customers were discussing the sketch the police had released again. "He could be anyone," one man said. "What if he's right here in this diner?" The thought made my skin crawl. After a while, the man at the counter stood up to leave. I watched as he walked out the door and into the night. I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. Just then, Sarah came running in, breathless and terrified. "Did you see him?" "The man outside," she gasped. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing again. "He's outside. I think he's watching us." Her eyes were wide with fear, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. We quickly moved to the front window and looked out. The man was standing there, staring into the diner. My stomach dropped. Joe noticed and decided to call the police. It felt like time stood still as we waited. The tension in the diner was unbearable. People were whispering and pointing, and I could feel the panic rising. Just then, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I sighed with relief, but it was fleeting. The police arrived shortly after and took our statements. I told them everything I had seen, but they couldn't do much without a solid lead. They assured us they would increase patrols around the diner, but I felt hollow. How could we keep ourselves safe if the killer was out there, lurking in the shadows? Days turned into weeks, and the murders continued. It felt like we were living in a real-life horror story. The police were doing their best, but with every new victim, the fear in the community grew stronger. I noticed fewer customers at the diner, and even Sarah seemed to be affected. Then, one night, I received a call from Joe. "You need to come to the diner right away," he said, his voice shaky. "We've got something important." I rushed over, my heart pounding. When I arrived, the diner was filled with police. They told us that they had received a tip about a possible suspect. The man we had seen before was connected to the murders, and they believed he was hiding nearby. They were gearing up to conduct a search in the area. The tension was palpable as we waited for news. Hours passed, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the police burst through the door. They had found him. My heart raced as they announced that the man had been apprehended just a few blocks away. The relief was overwhelming. After all those months of fear, the nightmare was finally coming to an end. The police informed us that the man was indeed the serial killer who had terrorized Atlanta all those years ago. He had gone into hiding but returned, thinking he could pick up where he left off. In the following days, the story unfolded in the news. The police found evidence linking him to all the murders, and he was finally charged. I remember watching the press conference, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and sadness for the victims and their families. As life in Atlanta slowly returned to normal, I still found myself thinking about those dark days. The diner became a symbol of resilience for our community. We had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger. I continued to visit, knowing that even in the scariest moments, we could find hope and healing. The killer was arrested, but the memories lingered. I realized that fear could grip even the safest places, but together, we could overcome it. The Blue Plate special was still on the menu, and as I sat in my booth, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the everyday moments that made life worth living, even in the face of unimaginable horror.